Hello and welcome to lecture number 3. Today's topic will be civil liberties. We'll explore the Bill of Rights in a fair amount of detail. A good place to begin a discussion of civil liberties would be to address all of the rights that are protected by the amendments in the Constitution. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to rewrite different amendments included in the Bill of Rights in your own words, and then evaluate which you believe to be the most important. Just a quick description of the Bill of Rights. These were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that were ratified by the end of 1791. These placed limits on what the government could and could not do. When it comes to the Bill of Rights, there's an important concept that's key to remember. No single right is absolute. My freedom to do something ends when it has the potential to trample on the rights of others, whether it's free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, whatever it may be. These are key limits to our individual rights. Now, we won't be exploring every single amendment included in the Bill of Rights, but we'll hit some of the highlights. Possibly the most important would be the First Amendment. Here we see the text of the First Amendment. A bunch of lawyers wrote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," and you can read the rest of this. Okay, so a bunch of lawyers wrote that First Amendment over 200 years ago. What does that actually mean? Well, political scientists and historians have basically said the First Amendment includes 5 so-called freedoms. We have freedom of religion, speech and press, to peacefully assemble, and to petition the government. Let's explore freedom of religion next. One of the key ideas included in freedom of religion would be the Establishment Clause. It comes from the text in the Constitution, or in the First Amendment, that says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion." A lot of times people have used this as a shorthand for the meaning of separation of church and state. This means that the government cannot force people to belong to one church or to any church, or cannot favor one religion over another. The words separation of church and state do not appear in the Constitution. They actually were coined by the gentleman shown here, Thomas Jefferson. There's also a free exercise clause included in the First Amendment. This allows people to practice their religious beliefs with as little government involvement as possible. However, some practices can and have been prohibited. For example, if I wanted to start my own religion, and we had human sacrifice as one of our rituals, that would not be allowed. While that may be an extreme example, practices such as polygamy and snake handling have been prohibited in the past. Now, when it comes to freedom of religion, this does not mean that the government can't aid religion in some way. There was an important case called the Lemon decision from the 1970s that resulted in the so-called Lemon test. The government can provide aid to church-related schools. Let's just say something like if a parochial school, a Catholic school, wanted to combine with a public school to have busing, they could do something like that. However, there were limits to the aid that the government could provide these churches. The aid had to be secular in purpose, not for religious reasons or religious curriculum. It cannot promote one religion over another or inhibit religion, and it should not excessively involve the government. Freedom of speech and press are also included in these 5 freedoms. Free speech is protected by the Constitution. There's a clear statement that declares, "Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech." Yet, remember that key concept to keep in mind? No single right is absolute, so there are limits on our ability to speak. For example, we could yell fire in a movie theater, but we could be held liable for that because that could cause chaos in a stampede and people could get hurt. Here's another thing. Slander is an oral statement that's damaging to a victim, and that's illegal. We clearly have freedom of the press. Part of the First Amendment declares Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of the press, yet no single right is absolute. So we could be held for libel if we have a written statement that damages a victim's reputation. Two other rights included in the First Amendment protect our ability to assemble or to gather as long as we're peaceful. And we also have the right to petition the government. We can complain, we can write our congressmen, we can write our congresswomen, we can write our senators or the president, and actually ask the government to take action and not be held liable or go into prison for doing something like that. So let's address something that's less controversial, like the Second Amendment. Here's the text of the Second Amendment. I'll let you go ahead and read it yourselves. We actually did not know the true meaning of the Second Amendment until a court case called the Heller decision was handed down by our courts in 2008. The bottom line was that this gave Americans an individual right to keep and bear arms. We never had a court recognize that before 2008. However, the court also said that our right to keep and bear arms can be regulated by the states and the federal government.
Remember that survey of political views that you completed at the beginning of the semester? Well, here we see one of the results of one of those questions. The question was, there are multiple gun control regulations in place today. There's no need for additional legislation. Survey takers could either agree with this, disagree with it, or remain undecided. As you can see from the results, more people disagreed with the statement. However, there were a significant number of people who were undecided, and still also a number of people who agreed with this. So I would argue that the issue of gun control regulations continues to be very divisive among students here at West Shore and in American society. Here's another question from that same survey. Do you think owners of a handgun should be required to register them? Here we see very strong support for mandates that people have their handguns registered. Handguns are a lot different than hunting rifles. And so anyway, I just thought I would share some of these results from that student survey. We'll have more throughout the course of the semester.
The bottom line when it comes to the Second Amendment is that we have an individual right to keep and bear arms. Yet, what the National Rifle Association might think is a just and logical regulation, and what a gun control organization like the Brady campaign might think might be two different things. And so that's where we get division along the political spectrum. In the next section, we'll explore due process and amendments 4 through 8. Essentially, due process requires the government to follow a set of guidelines or procedures if we are accused of a crime. These rights are found in Amendments 4 through 8. The Fourth Amendment declares that we have the right to privacy in our homes. We have protection against unreasonable searches. However, no single right is absolute. So the police can search our homes as long as there's probable cause. They also need a search warrant. Additionally, if we consent to a search, there's no need for a search warrant, and the police can search our homes or cars.
An example of this took place in recent months. In August of 2022, the FBI executed a search warrant at President Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence. Some people have called this a raid on the president's property, but in fact, the FBI had probable cause there were improper materials located at President Trump's residence. So they asked for a search warrant to search his home. This was approved by a judge. The FBI then executed that search warrant. They only undertook this search warrant after the FBI had undertaken several months of discussions with President Trump's attorneys. I believe the discussions actually began back in May of 2021. You may or may not be aware that classified documents also were found at President Biden's home and the home of Vice President Pence. A search warrant was not issued in their cases because they gave the government officials permission to search their homes. This was not the case with President Trump. Donald Trump was scheduled to go to trial in May of 2024, but the trial never took place because the judge dismissed the charges in that case. Prosecutors appealed the decision. However, once President Trump won the election in November of 2024, the case came to an end.
The Fifth Amendment protects us in many ways. For a major crime like murder, kidnapping, bank robbery, something like that, a grand jury would need to investigate the charges against us. It couldn't just be a single prosecutor. We also have protection against double jeopardy. Essentially, this means that we cannot be charged for the same crime twice. Additional rights are also included in the Fifth Amendment. If we're accused of a crime, we cannot be forced to incriminate ourselves. And our property cannot be taken from us without due process or without fair compensation. Each of these is included in the Fifth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment also covers due process. It outlines a series of rights that defendants have. If we're accused of a crime, we have the right to a speedy trial. We also can have a jury of our peers, and that trial can take place where that alleged crime was committed. If people are testifying against us, well, we can question those people. We can also bring our own witnesses to defend ourselves. We also have the right to an attorney. And we can get one even if we can't afford one, if we face jail time for the offense that we're charged with.
The amendments that were previously discussed identify due process and how the courts work in the United States. They demonstrate that people in the United States have certain rights regarding due process. Now let's consider some of the key issues involved with current events and these due process rights. When it comes to immigration, ICE agents these days are not always identifying themselves, and sometimes they're wearing masks when they detain people. Is this legal? Is this not? It looks like it might be legal. However, there still is some gray area there. There have also been some mistakes. U.S. resident Kilmar Abrego Garcia was deported due to what the administration described as an administrative error earlier in 2025. He was imprisoned without trial and eventually deported outside the United States. The Supreme Court unanimously declared that the United States had to facilitate his return to the United States. In August 2025, he was eventually detained again when he reported for a mandated court check-in. Mistakes like these have been made in the past, and we also see ICE agents going to places like Home Depot and different areas, and so is due process being followed? Is it not? The Trump administration has received criticism, but it's defended its actions as a result of trying to address crises in the United States at this time. You might be saying to yourself, well, how does this impact me? Well, this February in 2025, we received a memo from the administration whereby if we ever saw ICE agents or someone like that coming to the college, we had a set of guidelines that we should follow. The key was that we're supposed to balance student privacy with cooperation with the law and law enforcement. For me as an employee, if I was to be approached by someone, I've been told that I should ask for identification, and generally speaking, if they're looking for information, I should send any law enforcement to the college administration. And college administrators should always request documentation if they're asked to give information. And they're only supposed to give that documentation if a warrant has been issued, if information had been subpoenaed, or if there's a court order. So you can see that this is impacting lots of different people on a day-to-day basis. So why is this controversial? Why is this making headlines and things like that? Well, one of the foundational documents of the United States was the Declaration of Independence, where, as I think many of us know, that the colonies declared we did not want to have a king anymore and we wanted to separate from the British Empire. It had phrases along the lines of that all men are created equal, that everyone has unalienable rights, and it had been very critical of King George because he overstepped his authority. And again, I'm sure many of us are aware of the fact that taxes were implemented without consent. But other things that also were included in that Declaration of Independence is that they argued that the king had obstructed justice and that the king had deprived accused criminals of a jury trial. Some have argued that in recent months, the Trump administration has violated this foundational document of American history and a foundation of U.S. values. The courts will continue to address this issue over the next several months, and I'm sure this will come up again.
I'm going to skip the 7th Amendment, go straight to the 8th. The 8th is pretty straightforward. It protects us against cruel and unusual punishment. For example, the government can't torture us. Also, the punishment for a crime should fit the crime. I did want to address the 9th Amendment as well. Here's the text of the 9th Amendment. A bunch of lawyers wrote, "The enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people." What the heck is that supposed to mean? Okay, I'll try to break it down. Essentially, the 9th Amendment argues that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights provides a list of several rights for us. However, the people have other rights as well. It would be impossible to list every single right that people have. So there are other rights that exist, they're just not written down. The last topic I'd like to address would be the issue of privacy. The word privacy doesn't appear in the Bill of Rights. However, it's seen in a variety of ways, particularly in the 4th Amendment and 9th Amendment. That's where it's implied. The right to privacy was applied to a woman's right to have an abortion in a Supreme Court case from the 1970s. This was Roe versus Wade. What it did was it allowed women to have access to an abortion during the first trimester of a pregnancy. During the second trimester, states could regulate access to abortions. And during the third trimester, states could prohibit abortions.
I suspect many of you are familiar with the Dobbs decision, which was handed down in the summer of 2022. This struck down Roe v. Wade because the Supreme Court argued that it was egregiously wrongly decided. This is an example of judicial review. Our courts looking at the laws, looking at the Constitution, and they determined that the national government shouldn't be deciding this issue, but that states would decide the legal status of abortion within their state boundaries. So this is an example of one of those checks and balances put in place by the framers of the Constitution.
Well, we're just about at the end. I'd like to have some concluding statements next.
Now that you've watched this lecture, you should be able to summarize the rights that are protected by the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. A good way to show a deep understanding of those rights is by explaining them by using your own words. You should also be able to evaluate which of these rights you believe to be the most important. And finally, you want to be able to apply the concepts included with many of the current events that are going on right now. Where and how does due process fit in? I'm sure this will be a continued issue throughout the remainder of our semester this term.
Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new. Take care, and we'll see you again soon.